Imagine this. You walk into a temple buried in the sands of Egypt, its pillars scarred with furious hammer strikes, the walls once alive with stories now mutilated, erased, devoured by silence. The air is heavy, suffocating, as if the stones themselves are trying to hide what they once witnessed. A whole chapter of history, deliberately obliterated. And you ask yourself, why? Why would the most powerful civilization on earth attempt to wipe a single man from existence, his name, his god, even his bloodline? The answer is darker than the desert night. Because this pharaoh did not just defy the gods of Egypt. He defied nature itself. He married his own daughters. He bound his bloodline in forbidden union, claiming it was divine. And that sin, dressed in the robes of holiness, threatened to unravel the very order of the ancient world. His name was Akhenaten. To the priests, he was a heretic. To the people, a madman. But to himself? He was a chosen vessel of the sun, the only man who could stand between heaven and earth. He gazed at the solar disk, the Aten, and declared that no other gods mattered. No Ra, no Ammonius, no Osiris. Just him, his queen, his children, and the blazing face of the sun. But hidden beneath this revolution of faith was something far more sinister, a dynasty sealed not through politics, not through conquest, but through incestuous unions cloaked in the language of purity. The Egyptians had always flirted with this idea. Royalty marrying within the bloodline to preserve the divine essence. But Akhenaten pushed it into obsession. He shattered not only the temples of the old gods but the natural laws of kinship itself. His daughters, still young, were elevated not only as princesses but as wives, their faces carved into stone as companions, lovers, bearers of his future heirs. What does it do to a people, when the figure meant to embody balance descends into chaos? When the divine ruler turns the sacred into corruption? This is why his name was erased. This is why his statues were smashed. Because Akhenaten's crime was not just against tradition, it was against the psychological order that held Egypt together. A pharaoh who claimed the sun as his god, and his own blood as his eternal bride. This is the secret you were never meant to hear. And tonight, I will take you down the forbidden corridors of his reign, where faith became madness, and madness became law. Understand Akhenaten, you must first understand the world he was born into. Egypt was not just a kingdom. It was an empire of gods and stone, of eternal cycles guarded by priests who claimed to speak for the heavens. At its heart stood Ammonius, the hidden god, the breath of creation itself. His temples at Karnak were not simply places of worship, they were vaults of power. Their wealth rivaled the pharaoh himself. Their influence reached into every field, every soldier's ration, every whisper of prayer in the marketplace. For centuries, the priests and the crown had lived in balance, each needing the other. But then came the boy who would not obey. Born Amenhotep IV, he inherited not just the throne, but a simmering tension between kingship and priesthood. The priests of Ammonius thought him weak, strange in appearance, delicate in frame, almost androgynous. They believed he would bend, that he would follow the path of his ancestors and honor the old gods. They were wrong. Because within this young man burned a fire, an obsession with a power greater than the hidden god of Karnak. The Aten, the visible sun, the blazing face of eternity. Where Ammonius was secret, Aten was undeniable. Where Ammonius was shadow, Aten was light. And Akhenaten craved light like an addict craves poison. He did not challenge the priests with open war, not at first. He did it with whispers, with art, with a slow reshaping of how Egypt saw the divine. Sculptures began to show him not as a perfect god-king, but as a frail, elongated figure under the rays of Aten. His queen, Nefertiti, was not depicted as an obedient consort, but as his equal, their daughters shone in scenes of intimacy, playing, laughing, touched by the sun's hands. It was beautiful, but it was also dangerous. Because this was not just art. This was doctrine. A message that the divine now lived not in the temples of Ammonius, but in the royal family itself. And here lies the first psychological twist. If Aten was the only god, then Akhenaten was his only prophet. If the royal family lived beneath Aten's rays, then no outsider could be pure enough to join their blood. The priests saw it. They understood what was coming before the people did. Akhenaten was isolating himself, his wife, his daughters, not as mortals, but as sacred vessels of the sun. Marriage alliances with foreign kingdoms? Irrelevant. Priestly approval? Broken. He was laying the foundation for a dynasty not of men, but of gods. And that foundation would demand something unthinkable, the union of father and child, a merging of blood so pure, so forbidden, that it would terrify even the gods of Egypt. By the 5th year of his reign, the masks had fallen. Amenhotep was no more, he renamed himself Akhenaten, the living spirit of Aten. And with that act, he declared war, not just on the priests of Ammonius, but on 3,000 years of Egyptian order. Imagine the shock, temples closed, statues of the old gods smashed, their names erased from inscriptions. A kingdom that had worshipped dozens of deities now told to kneel before a single sun disk. The people murmured in fear, the priests seethed in rage, but the pharaoh pressed forward. He was not merely changing religion, he was rewriting reality itself. To crown his revolution, he abandoned Thebes, the heart of Egypt, and carved a new city from the desert sands. He called it Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten. No shadows, no hidden chambers. A city of blinding light, open-air temples where the sun's rays fell directly upon altars, bypassing the priests entirely. For the first time in Egypt's history, the middlemen of the divine, the temple elite, were cut out. Akhenaten himself was the only mediator between heaven and earth. And in the center of this radiant city, he placed not just himself, but his family. His wife, Nefertiti, stood as the earthly mirror of Aten's beauty. His 6 daughters, still young, were paraded as living extensions of the divine essence. The carvings are unsettling even now. Reliefs show Akhenaten cradling his daughters, kissing their faces, holding them with an intimacy never before seen in Egyptian royal art. The rays of Aten bend downward, their tiny hands offering life not just to the pharaoh, but to the children themselves, as if the sun had blessed them as eternal companions, not merely offspring. To the priests, these images were not just blasphemy, they were prophecy of corruption. A family closed in upon itself, worshipping its own blood as sacred. And then, the whispers began. That Akhenaten's eldest daughter, Meritaten, was no longer simply his child. She was his queen. In later inscriptions, her figure appears elevated, rivaling even her mother's. Other daughters, too, were depicted with titles normally reserved for wives. This was more than dynastic symbolism. This was the pharaoh declaring to the world, only his bloodline was divine enough to marry itself. Father and daughter. God and vessel. A union of forbidden purity. It is here, in the golden blaze of Akhenaten, that the mask of revolution dropped and revealed its true face, not liberation, not devotion, but possession. A man so consumed by his vision that he was willing to twist the natural laws of kinship into a shrine of his own power, when threatened, never dies quietly. As Akhenaten tightened his grip on Egypt, the priests of Ammonius understood the true danger. This was not just a religious dispute. It was annihilation. Their wealth, their temples, their centuries of influence, all crumbling under the weight of a pharaoh who claimed the sun itself. Yet Akhenaten was clever. He knew their strength came from alliances, marriages, and bloodlines that stretched across kingdoms. So he destroyed the very concept of alliance. His daughters, instead of being offered as brides to foreign princes, were claimed by him. Locked away within his own household, turned into symbols of a divine purity no outsider could ever touch. This was more than lust. It was strategy. By refusing to let his bloodline mingle with others, Akhenaten ensured that no priest, no rival, no foreign power could claim kinship with his throne. The royal family became a closed circuit, self-contained, self-worshipping, untouchable. And the psychological message was clear: the pharaoh's blood was so sacred, so incandescent with divine fire, that only itself was worthy of its embrace. Daughter as wife. Child as queen. A lineage that bent the natural order to maintain its absolute sovereignty. But what does a kingdom become when its ruler elevates madness as holy law? The fractures were everywhere. Soldiers grumbled. Farmers cursed under their breath. The gods of Egypt, Osiris, Hathor, Ptah, still lived in the hearts of the people, even as their statues were defiled. And in the shadows, the priests sharpened their knives, waiting. Akhenaten's vision had not only broken faith with tradition, it had broken the psychological spine of the nation. Look closely at the art of this time, and you will see it. The royal family gathered beneath the Aten, surrounded by rays, smiling, intimate, almost fragile. But outside the city of Akhenaten? Silence. The rest of Egypt withered while the pharaoh built his radiant prison. And inside that prison, his daughters bore the titles of queens, companions, consorts. Historians argue whether the unions were consummated, but that is missing the point. In the mind of the pharaoh, they already were. For he had declared them holy brides of Aten, and Aten's prophet was himself. And this is where you, listening now, must pause and ask, what happens to a nation when truth is dictated not by reality, but by the delusion of one man with absolute power? When incest becomes divine decree, when love is weaponized as control? Halfway through this descent, I want you to mark yourself as someone who dares to keep walking these forbidden corridors. Comment below the phrase, "Blood is fire, fire is truth," twice. Write it once for the world to see, and once for yourself, to seal the fact that you are not a passive listener, but a man awakening to the truths buried in shadow. Utopias never last. Not when they are built on lies. For 17 years Akhenaten ruled beneath the blazing Aten, convinced that his light would outshine every shadow. But shadows always return. His city, Akhenaten, gleamed with temples open to the sky, yet beyond its walls, Egypt starved. The wealth that once poured into Karnak's treasuries now bled into sand. Crops failed. Borders crumbled. Enemies pressed in from every side, sensing weakness in a kingdom too busy worshipping the pharaoh's obsession to defend itself. And within the royal palace, that obsession twisted tighter. His eldest daughter, Akhenaten, was elevated to a place beside him. In carvings, her image is adorned not as child, but as queen. When Nefertiti vanishes from the record, whether dead, exiled, or erased, Akhenaten steps into her role. To the world, the message was unmistakable: Akhenaten's line would marry itself. His god demanded purity, and purity meant incest. What began as rumor became doctrine carved in stone. The pharaoh of Egypt had turned his own blood into his wives. But the people were no longer blind. Whispers of sickness spread. Bodies grew thin. Even the royal daughters, shown in art as sickly, fragile, and elongated, carried the mark of genetic collapse. For when blood marries blood, it does not create gods. It creates weakness. The very strategy Akhenaten thought would immortalize his dynasty became the poison that would destroy it. His daughters, trapped as vessels of divine union, bore children who would not survive. His so-called sacred blood carried within it the slow death of his line. Meanwhile, the priests sharpened their revenge. They waited, watching, knowing the pharaoh could not fight forever. The temples of Aten were radiant, yes, but hollow. No one believed as he believed. Outside his shining city, the people still prayed to Osiris, to Ammonius, to the gods that had held them for millennia. Akhenaten thought he had silenced them. He had only made them patient. By the end, he was a man surrounded not by worshippers, but by cracks. His armies weakened. His borders lost. His heirs fragile and dying. And his legacy, a dynasty married into itself, rotting before it even took root. The greatest irony of his reign was this: in trying to become eternal, Akhenaten made himself ephemeral. His bloodline, closed upon itself like a serpent eating its own tail, was doomed to extinction. This was not divine purity. It was self-destruction dressed in holy robes. And soon, the knives would come out. The end came quietly, like a candle snuffed in a dark chamber. One day, Akhenaten was the blazing prophet of Aten. The next, he was gone. No great battle, no glorious farewell, only silence. Some whisper he was poisoned, others that sickness consumed him, perhaps the same frailty that stained his bloodline. Whatever the truth, Egypt did not mourn him. His death was not the passing of a god, but the release of a kingdom held hostage by obsession. And the moment his body grew cold, the knives he feared began their work. The priests of Ammonius rose like vultures circling a corpse. They moved swiftly, reclaiming their temples, resurrecting their gods, and turning their fury upon Akhenaten's memory. His city of Akhenaten was abandoned, left to the sand. His temples were dismantled stone by stone, repurposed for new monuments. His name was chiseled out of every inscription, his image shattered, his bloodline cursed. It was as if the Pharaoh who once defied all the gods had never lived at all. But the curse did not end with him. His daughters, those crowned as brides and queens in his twisted order, were left vulnerable. Some records hint they became wives to generals or scribes, a desperate attempt to salvage what was left of their broken blood. Others vanish entirely, their lives devoured by silence. And then there is the boy who followed, Akhenaten, a child king born from the tangled branches of Akhenaten's union. He would be renamed Tutankhamun, forced to abandon Aten and bow once more to Ammonius. His reign would be short, his health broken, his body twisted by the weight of his cursed inheritance. The sins of the father carved into the bones of the son. The priests knew what they were doing. Erasing Akhenaten was not just revenge, it was psychological warfare. They wanted his story to be forgotten, his vision buried. No mention of the city of light. No whisper of daughters turned into wives. No trace of the man who tried to make himself eternal. To destroy him, they did not kill his body. They killed his memory. For in Egypt, true death was not the moment the heart stopped beating. It was the moment your name was no longer spoken. And so Akhenaten, once the living spirit of Aten, became nothing but dust in the desert. A forgotten heretic. A father who turned his daughters into queens, only to watch his dynasty collapse into ruin. A man who reached for godhood, and fell into silence. History is never erased by accident. When a man's face is chiseled from stone, when his name is carved out of every record, it is not just vengeance. It is ritual. It is power. Akhenaten's destruction became the ultimate warning, a psychological monument to obedience. The priests and rulers who followed knew exactly what they were doing. They turned his memory into a ghost story whispered through generations: defy the gods, and you will be erased. Break the order of blood and throne, and you will vanish. His daughters, his city, his Aten, all reduced to shadows. His existence became the tool of fear, a silent lesson to ensure no one would dare repeat his crime. Think about this. For centuries, Egyptian pharaohs were remembered as gods on earth. Their statues towered for millennia, their names survived in temples, tombs, and scrolls. Yet Akhenaten, one of the most powerful rulers in history, was systematically deleted. Why? Because erasure itself is the purest form of control. To remove memory is to remove identity. And what is a man without memory? Nothing. But here lies the darker truth: Akhenaten's fate was not unique. His story was only the first draft of a script repeated by empires, kings, and institutions throughout history. The same methods used to erase him have been used to silence prophets, burn books, censor heretics, and bury forbidden knowledge across the centuries. Erasure is not random. It is the operating system of power. Even in the modern world, the pattern repeats. Families rise, intoxicated by their own blood, their own secrets, their own belief in purity. They seal themselves off, turning inward, convinced they are chosen, convinced they are eternal. But history always punishes closed bloodlines, just as it punished Akhenaten. Weakness spreads. Collapse follows. And then, when the structure falls, the survivors rewrite the story, erasing the corruption, painting the rulers as gods, heroes, or saviors. The truth is buried again, just as it was beneath the sands of Akhenaten. You see, Akhenaten's union with his daughters was not just incest. It was the symbol of what power does when unchecked: it consumes itself. It folds inward until the very thing it tries to preserve becomes its destruction. And that is why his story still matters. Because even though they tried to erase him, fragments remain. Whispers in stone. Ghosts in art. And for those who listen, a warning carved in silence. Now you see it. Akhenaten's life was not just the story of a pharaoh who worshipped the sun. It was the blueprint of corruption itself, a man who believed he could bend reality, erase gods, and rewrite the laws of nature. And for a time, he succeeded. He built his radiant city. He crowned his daughters as queens. He forced an empire to kneel to his vision. But in the end, his own blood betrayed him. His obsession devoured him. And his memory was executed with more precision than any blade could deliver. This is the eternal law of power: when rulers turn inward, when they seal their blood, when they claim divine authority for themselves alone, they collapse. It does not matter if it is a pharaoh in the sands of Egypt, an emperor in Rome, a monarch in Europe, or an institution in the modern world. Power that consumes itself always dies. And the rulers of history know this. That is why they bury stories like Akhenaten's. That is why they silence them, erase them, and hide them in fragments of broken temples. Because if men like you knew the truth, you would recognize the same pattern in the powers that govern you today. Look closer. Our world is not so different. Names vanish. Histories are rewritten. Families of power guard their bloodlines, build their empires, and claim they are chosen, destined, eternal. But they are not eternal. They are repeating the same error, walking the same path into the same desert silence. And just as Akhenaten was erased, so too will they be. Not because the gods strike them down, but because corruption is always self-destruction disguised as divinity. So, why have I told you this? Because this is dangerous knowledge. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. You cannot look at history, or at power, the same way again. You now carry the curse of awareness, the ability to recognize when order is just illusion, when authority is just corruption dressed in holy robes. And that awareness changes you. It makes you dangerous, because you can no longer be fooled by the stories written in stone. Akhenaten married his daughters and called it divine. They erased him to hide the shame. But fragments survive, and now you hold them. His failure is your lesson: never worship false sons, never surrender your mind to the illusions of power, and never let history's silence bury the truth inside you. For those who see through the lies, cannot be erased.